Hello, viewers, once again. Welcome to another section of the same discussion we've been having on the basic structure doctrine and the implications of the ruling of the High Court, if upheld by the Supreme Court. Now, before we go further, you can pause, you can subscribe, press the subscribe button, and be a part of this conversation as we forge ahead into discussing matters concerning our country and what the happenings in our country mean for all of us. So I, for one, think that the ruling on the basic structure doctrine, if upheld by the Supreme Court, does not necessarily mean that the Building Bridges Initiative did not apply it. Because you can say that the basic structure doctrine holds. Yes? And for some reason, Kenya subscribes to that thinking insofar as the four sequential steps in making a constitution are concerned. And whatever is prescribed in the three levels of amendment power is understood in the Kenyan constitutional jurisdiction. We have the primary constituent power as proposed by Yani verse 9, where you have civic education, you have constituent assemblies, you have public participation and a referendum. These four processes are well guided within our constitution. They are not stated, but they are understood in their fullness. You see, our constitution does not necessarily speak of a basic structure doctrine, but the processes proposed by the basic structure doctrine are applied oftenly in our constitutional processes. Civic education is something that is often there. For instance, when you have when Parliament is to enact a law, they conduct public participation. So all these processes, referenda, public participation, civic education, constituent assemblies, these are processes that are not foreign to our practice. So you can say that it applies and still be right in that sense. If what you're calling basic structure doctrine is having those four sequential steps in the primary constituent power, then you have public participation and referendum in the secondary constituent power, then you have public participation and parliamentary processes in the constituted power, then you have simply observed the basic structure doctrine without it being stated necessarily. Even though those processes are not stated verbatim, they are not stated verbatim in our constitution, but they are understood to some extent. When I say that it could be a violation of Article 2 of the Constitution, it's because the Constitution prescribes how it can be amended, either by popular initiative. So in the popular initiative criteria, the Constitution does not verbatim say that you have to have civic education, you have to have public participation, you have to have constituent assemblies. It doesn't. Okay, public participation is there because those are you obtain signatures from the electorate, so you have to have at least 1 million signatures from the electorate, and then they engage in a referendum. So the two of the sequential steps are not understood within the popular initiative format. So when the court said that the basic structure doctrine applies in Kenya, it's true that it does. It's true that it does. But when they say that the Constitution ought to, the amendments proposed by the Building Bridges Initiative ought to have been conducted under the primary constituent power, that is where there is a coup on the Constitution. I think that should be clear. When they say that the basic structure doctrine applies in Kenya, it's true that it does, because we subscribe to some of the prescriptions it has. Actually, not some, but all, especially on levels of amendment power. The first level, the primary constituent power. Second level, where we have the secondary constituent power, you only have 2 of the processes from the 4 in the primary constituent power. Then we have the constituted power, where you have public participation in Kenya, and you have parliamentary power. So for Parliament to amend the Constitution, they have to have public participation, and then the amendment stands. But there are things that Parliament can amend through public participation alone. But there are those amendments that require a referendum, and a referendum is not understood as a third level exercise, but it's a first and second level exercise. So in ruling that the basic structure doctrine applies in Kenya, that is true. But in stating that when amending the Constitution through the Building Bridges Initiative, the promoters ought to have undertaken the sequential steps under the primary constituent power, then it is a coup on the supremacy of the Constitution. So I submit that the basic structure doctrine applies to the extent that its application is consistent with the Constitution. Insofar as its application is not as prescribed in Articles 255 to 257, insofar as its application is consistent with that framework in Articles 255 to 257, then it applies without a violation of the Constitution. But if you apply it in total, and the sense of application is, you state that the proposed amendments were hyper amendments, and therefore they ought to have been exercised through the primary constituent power, then we need to understand, what we need to understand is, how did we determine hyper amendments? How did that concept come about in the constitution making process? How did the courts determine that what were being carried out were hyper amendments